The police report calls it a suicide, but the last page of her diary tells a different.
Part 25 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 25. William Andrew Horne, Esquire, executed for murder. The short notice which we give of this man exhibits a human being reduced far below the level of a beast. The subject of the memoir was the eldest son of a gentleman of fortune in Nottinghamshire, who in vain strove to instil into the mind of his son any of those principles of rectitude without which a man cannot be considered to be humanized. The sports of the field, and all the dissipation which a country squire could at that time obtain, formed the amusements of this reckless youth. His passion for women was unbounded, but his love of gold surpassed all the other bad qualities which so peculiarly distinguished him. It was while his father yet lived that he committed that crime for which his life was eventually forfeited, and it appears to have occurred in the following manner. His passion for women led him to commit the most disgusting excesses, and at length so far he had carried his crimes that an incestuous connection took place between him and his sister, the result of which was the birth of a boy in the month of February 1724. Horne told his brother Charles of the circumstance 3 days afterwards, and at 10 o'clock at night said that he must take a ride with him. He then put the newborn infant in a bag, and mounting their horses they rode to Annesley in Nottinghamshire, at the distance of 5 miles, carrying the child alternately. On their arrival near the village, William dismounted and inquired if the child was living, and being answered in the affirmative, he took it and told his brother to wait till he came back. On his return, Charles demanded to know how he had disposed of the infant, to which he said he had placed it behind a haystack and covered it with hay. They then returned home, and it was afterwards learned that the child died in the course of the night from exposure to the cold. But in a short time afterwards, a quarrel arising between the brothers, the whole transaction was communicated by Charles to his father. The latter enjoined him to the strictest secrecy, and this injunction was obeyed up to the time of the old man's death, which occurred in the year 1747, in the 102nd year of his age. The real estate of the family being entailed, then descended to the eldest son, but the father had previously made over his personal property by deed of gift to his son Charles. No sooner had the new squire assumed the government of the estate than he behaved with the utmost severity towards his brother as well as his tenants, and at length the former, rendered miserable by his participation in the horrid act, having some business to transact with Mr. Cook, an attorney at Derby, told him of the long-concealed affair, and asked for his advice. The lawyer told him to go to a justice of the peace and make a full discovery of the whole transaction, and he accordingly went to a magistrate and acquainted him with what had happened. He hesitated to take cognizance of the matter, however, saying that it might hang half the family, and as it had passed so many years ago, advised that it might remain a secret. No further notice of the circumstance was then taken until the year 1754, when Charles, being suddenly seized with a severe fit of illness, called in a Mr. White of Ripley, to whom, in anticipation of his death, he disclosed all that had occurred. Mr. White declined to interfere, but his patient almost immediately recovered, declaring that he had been better ever since the weight of the transaction had been taken off his mind by his making the disclosure. The discovery, however, soon became a matter of notoriety, and William Horne, having quarrelled with a publican named Roe, the latter called him an incestuous old dog. A suit in the ecclesiastical court at Lichfield was the consequence, and Roe, being unsuccessful, was ordered to pay all the costs. The circumstance inflamed him with revenge, and having made such inquiries as persuaded him of the truth of the report which he had heard, he procured a warrant to be issued for the apprehension of his late opponent. A constable of Annesley and he in consequence proceeded to the house of the squire at about 8 o'clock in the evening, and after having experienced considerable difficulty, succeeded in obtaining admittance. A strict search was then commenced, but it was not until a long time had elapsed that they discovered the object of their inquiry concealed in a large box, which had been described as containing clean linen. He was immediately carried before 2 justices, who committed him to take his trial at the following assizes. On the 10th of August 1759 he was brought to trial before Lord Chief Baron Parker, and after a hearing of about 9 hours, The jury found him guilty, and sentence of death passed, of course. Horn, being convicted on a Saturday, was sentenced to die on the Monday following, but a number of gentlemen waited on the judge, intimating that he had been so long hardened in iniquity that a farther time would be necessary to prepare him for his awful change, and a respite of a month was in consequence granted. When this time was nearly expired, he received a reprieve during His Majesty's pleasure, so that he began to entertain hopes of obtaining a free pardon, and he employed a considerable part of his time in writing to his friends to make interest to secure this object. He, however, confessed the justice of his conviction, but seemed little affected by the enormity of his crime, and frequently said, "It was damned hard to suffer on the evidence of a brother for a crime committed so many years before." He gave the following account of the transaction. He said he had no design of destroying the infant, but put it in a bag lined with wool, and made a hole in the bag that it might not be stifled. He added that the child was handsomely dressed, and he had intended to have left it at the door of Mr. Charworth of Annesley, but the dogs barking, and there being a light in the house, he desisted from his first intention in the fear of a discovery. After some hesitation, he said, he resolved to place it under a warm haystack, in the hope that, when the servants came to fodder the cattle in the morning, it would be found. He acknowledged to a clergyman who assisted him in his devotions that he forgave all his enemies, even his brother Charles, but made the following strange addition to his speech, that if at the day of judgment God Almighty should ask him how his brother behaved, he would not give him a good character. The hopes of a pardon which he had entertained soon proved unfounded, and an order arrived for his execution on the 11th of December 1759, on which day he completed his 74th year, and terminated his life on a scaffold erected at Nottingham. Lawrence Earl Ferrers, executed for murder. Lawrence Earl Ferrers was a man of singular and most unhappy disposition. Descended of an ancient and noble family, he was doomed to expiate a crime of which he had been guilty at Tyburn. It would appear that the royal blood of the Plantagenets flowed in his veins, and the Earl gained his title in the following manner. The second baronet of the family, Sir Henry Shirley, married a daughter of the celebrated Earl of Essex, who was beheaded in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and his son, Sir Robert Shirley, died in the Tower, where he was confined during the Protectorate, for his attachment to the cause of the Stuarts. Upon the Restoration, the second son of Sir Robert succeeded to the title and estates, and Charles, anxious to cement the bonds which attached his friends to him, summoned him to the upper house of Parliament by the title of Lord Ferrers of Chartley, as the descendant of one of the co-heiresses of the Earl of Essex, the title, which had existed since the reign of Edward III, having been in abeyance since the death of that unfortunate nobleman. In the year 1711, Robert, Lord Ferrers, was created by Queen Anne, Viscount Tamworth and Earl Ferrers, and it appears that although the estates of the family were very great, they were vastly diminished by the provisions which the Earl thought proper to make for his numerous progeny, consisting of 15 sons and 12 daughters, born to him by his 2 wives. At the death of the first Earl, his title descended to his second son, but he dying without issue, it went in succession to the 9th son, who was childless, and the 10th son, who was the father of the Earl Lawrence, the subject of the present sketch. This nobleman was united in the year 1752 to the youngest daughter of Sir William Meredith, but although his general conduct when sober was not such as to be remarkable, yet his faculties were so much impaired by drink, that when under the influence of intoxication he acted with all the wildness and brutality of a madman. For a time his wife perceived nothing which induced her to repent the step she had taken in being united to him, but he subsequently behaved to her with such unwarrantable cruelty that she was compelled to quit his protection, and rejoining her father's family to apply to Parliament for redress. An Act was in consequence passed, allowing her a separate maintenance to be raised out of her husband's estate, and trustees being appointed, the unfortunate Mr. Johnson, who fell a sacrifice to the ungovernable passions of Lord Ferrers, having been bred up in the family from his youth, and being distinguished for the regular manner in which he kept his accounts, and his fidelity as a steward, was proposed as receiver of the rents for her use. He at first declined the office, but subsequently, at the desire of the Earl himself, he consented to act, and continued in this employment for a considerable time. His lordship at this time lived at Stanton, a seat about 2 miles from Ashby-de-la-Zouch in Leicestershire, and his family consisted of Mrs. Clifford, a lady who lived with him and her 4 natural daughters, besides 5 men servants, exclusive of an old man and a boy, and 3 maids. Mr. Johnson lived at the house belonging to the farm, which he held under his lordship, called the Lount, about half a mile distant from Stanton. It appears that it was his custom to visit his noble master occasionally to settle the accounts which were placed under his care, but his lordship gradually conceived a dislike for him, grounded upon the prejudice raised in his mind on account of his being the receiver of the Countess's portion, and charged him with having combined with the trustees to prevent his receiving a coal contract. From this time he spoke of him in opprobrious terms, and said he had conspired with his enemies to injure him, and that he was a villain, and with these sentiments he gave him warning to quit an advantageous farm which he held under his lordship. Finding, however, that the trustees under the Act of Separation had already granted him a lease of it, it having been promised to him by the Earl or his relations, he was disappointed, and probably from that time he meditated a more cruel revenge. The circumstances immediately attending the transaction, which terminated in the death of Johnson, are as follows. On Sunday the 13th of January 1760, my lord went to the Lount, and after some discourse with Mr. Johnson, ordered him to come to him at Stanton on the Friday following, the 18th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His lordship's usual dinner hour was 2 o'clock, and soon after that meal was disposed of, on the Friday he went to Mrs. Clifford, who was in the still house, and desired her to take the children for a walk. She accordingly prepared herself and her daughters, and with the permission of the Earl went to her father's at a short distance, being directed to return at 5:30. The men servants were next dispatched on errands by their master, who was thus left in the house with the 3 females only. In a short time afterwards Mr. Johnson came according to his appointment, and was admitted by one of the maidservants, named Elizabeth Bergland. He proceeded at once to his lordship's apartment, but was desired to wait in the still house, and then, after the expiration of about 10 minutes, the Earl, calling him into his own room, went in with him and locked the door. Being thus together, the Earl required him first to settle an account, and then charging him with the villainy which he attributed to him, ordered him to kneel down. The unfortunate man went down on one knee, upon which the Earl, in a tone of voice loud enough to be heard by the maidservants without, cried, "Down on your other knee, declare that you have acted against Lord Ferrers, your time is come, you must die," and then suddenly drawing a pistol from his pocket, which was loaded, he presented it and immediately fired. The ball entered the body of the unfortunate man, but he rose up and entreated that no farther violence might be done him, and the female servants at that time coming to the door, being alarmed by the report, his lordship quitted the room. A messenger was immediately dispatched for Mr. Kirkland, a surgeon, who lived at Ashby-de-la-Zouch, and Johnson being put to bed, his lordship went to him and asked him how he felt. He answered that he was dying, and desired that his family might be sent for. Miss Johnson soon after arrived, and Lord Ferrers immediately followed her into the room where her father lay. He then pulled down the clothes, and applied a pledget, dipped in arquebusied water, to the wound, and soon after left him. From this time it appears that his lordship applied himself to his favourite amusement, drinking, until he became exceedingly violent, for at the time of the commission of the murder he is reported to have been sober, and on the arrival of Mr. Kirkland he told him that he had shot Johnson, but believed he was more frightened than hurt, that he had intended to shoot him dead, for that he was a villain and deserved to die. "But," said he, "now I have spared his life, I desire you would do what you can for him." His lordship at the same time desired that he would not suffer him to be seized, and declared that, if any one should attempt it, he would shoot him. Mr. Kirkland, who wisely determined to say whatever might keep Lord Ferrers from any further outrages, told him that he should not be seized, and directly went to the wounded man. The patient complained of a violent pain in his bowels, and Mr. Kirkland preparing to search the wound, my lord informed him of the direction of it by showing him how he held the pistol when he fired it. Mr. Kirkland found the ball had lodged in the body, at which his lordship expressed great surprise, declaring that he had tried that pistol a few days before, and that it then carried a ball through a deal board near 1.5 inches thick. Mr. Kirkland then went downstairs to prepare some dressings, and my lord soon after left the room. From this time, in proportion as the liquor which he continued to drink took effect, his passions became more tumultuous, and the transient fit of compassion mixed with fear for himself, which had excited him, gave way to starts of rage and the predominance of malice. He went up into the room where Johnson was dying, and pulled him by the wig, calling him villain, and threatening to shoot him through the head. And the last time he went to him, he was with great difficulty prevented from tearing the clothes off the bed, that he might strike him. A proposal was made to him in the evening by Mrs. Clifford that Mr. Johnson should be removed to his own house, but he replied, "He shall not be removed. I will keep him here to plague the villain." He afterwards spoke to Miss Johnson about her father, and told her that if he died he would take care of her and of the family, provided they did not prosecute. When his lordship went to bed, which was between 11 and 12, he told Mr. Kirkland that he knew he could, if he would, set the affair in such a light as to prevent his being seized, desiring that he might see him before he went away in the morning, and declaring that he would rise at any hour. Mr. Kirkland, however, was very solicitous to get Mr. Johnson removed, and as soon as the Earl was gone he set about carrying his object into effect. He, in consequence, went to Lount, and having fitted up an easy chair with poles by way of a sedan, and procured a guard, he returned at about 2 o'clock and carried Mr. Johnson to his house, where he expired at about 9 o'clock of the following morning. The neighbours now began to take measures to secure the murderer, and a few of them, having armed themselves, set out for Stanton, and as they entered the yard they saw his lordship, partly undressed, going towards the stable, as if to take out a horse. One of them, named Springthorpe, then advancing towards his lordship with a pistol in his hand, required him to surrender, but the latter putting his hand towards his pocket, his assailant, imagining that he was feeling for some weapon of offence, stopped short and allowed him to escape into the house. A great concourse of people by this time had come to the spot, and they cried out loudly that the Earl should come forth. 2 hours elapsed, however, before anything was seen of him, and then he came to the garret window and called out, "How is Johnson?" He was answered that he was dead, but he said it was a lie, and desired that the people should disperse. But then he gave orders that they should be let in and be furnished with victuals and drink, and finally he went away from the window, swearing that no man should take him. The mob still remained on the spot, and in about 2 hours the Earl was descried by a collier named Curtis, walking on the bowling green, armed with a blunderbuss, a brace of pistols, and a dagger. Curtis, however, so far from being intimidated by his bold appearance, walked up to him, and his lordship, struck with the resolution he displayed, immediately surrendered himself and gave up his arms, but directly afterwards declared that he had killed the villain, and gloried in the act. He was instantly conveyed in custody to a public house at Ashby, kept by a man named Kinsey, and a coroner's jury having brought in a verdict of wilful murder against him, he was on the following Monday committed to the custody of the keeper of the jail at Leicester. Being entitled, however, by his rank to be tried before his peers, he was in about a fortnight afterwards conveyed to London, in his landau, drawn by 6 horses under a strong guard, and being carried before the House of Lords he was committed to the custody of the Black Rod, and ordered to the Tower, where he arrived at about 6 o'clock in the evening of the 14th of February. He is reported to have behaved during the whole journey, and at his commitment, with great calmness and propriety. He was confined in the Round Tower, near the drawbridge. 2 wardens were constantly in the room with him, and 1 at the door. 2 sentinels were posted at the bottom of the stairs, and 1 upon the drawbridge, with their bayonets fixed, and from this time the gates were ordered to be shut an hour sooner than usual. During his confinement he was moderate both in eating and drinking. His breakfast was a half-pint basin of tea, with a small spoonful of brandy in it, and a muffin. With his dinner he generally drank a pint of wine and a pint of water, and another pint of each with his supper. In general his behaviour was decent and quiet, except that he would sometimes suddenly start, tear open his waistcoat, and use other gestures, which showed that his mind was disturbed. Mrs. Clifford and the 4 young ladies who had come up with him from Leicestershire took a lodging in Tower Street, and for some time a servant was continually passing with letters between them, but afterwards this correspondence was permitted only once a day. Mrs. Clifford came 3 times to the Tower to see him, but was not admitted, but his children were suffered to be with him some time. On the 16th of April, having been a prisoner in the Tower 2 months and 2 days, he was brought to his trial, which continued till the 18th, before the House of Lords, assembled for that purpose, Lord Henley, Keeper of the Great Seal, having been created Lord High Steward upon the occasion. The murder was easily proved to have been committed in the manner we have described, and his lordship then proceeded to enter upon his defence. He called several witnesses, the object of whose testimony was to show that the Earl was not of sound mind, but none of them proved such an insanity as made him not accountable for his conduct. His lordship managed this defence himself in such a manner as showed an uncommon understanding. He mentioned the fact of his being reduced to the necessity of attempting to prove himself a lunatic, that he might not be deemed a murderer, with the most delicate and affecting sensibility; and when he found that his plea could not avail him, he confessed that he made it only to gratify his friends, that he was always averse to it himself, and that it had prevented what he had proposed, and what perhaps might have taken off the malignity, at least, of the accusation. The peers having in the usual form delivered their verdict of guilty, his lordship received sentence to be hanged on Monday 21st of April, and then to be anatomised; but in consideration of his rank the execution of this sentence was respited till Monday the 5th of May. During this interval he made a will, by which he left £1,300 to Mr. Johnson's children, £1,000 to each of his 4 natural daughters, and £60 a year to Mrs. Clifford for her life; but this disposition of his property, being made after his conviction, was not valid, although it was said at that time, or nearly the same provision was afterwards made for the parties named. In the meantime a scaffold was erected under the gallows at Tyburn, and part of it, about a yard square, was raised about 18 inches above the rest of the floor, with a contrivance to sink down upon a signal given, in accordance with the plan now invariably adopted, the whole being covered with black baize. On the morning of the 5th of May, at about 9 o'clock, his lordship's body was demanded of the keeper of the Tower by the sheriffs of London and Middlesex, and his lordship, being informed of it, sent a message to the sheriffs, requesting that he might be permitted to be conveyed to the scaffold in his own landau, in preference to the mourning coach which was provided for him. This being granted, his landau, drawn by 6 horses, immediately drew up, and he entered it accompanied by Mr. Humphreys, the chaplain of the Tower, who had been admitted to him on that morning for the first time. On the carriage reaching the outer gate, the Earl was delivered up to the sheriffs, and Mr. Sheriff Vaillant entered the vehicle with him, expressing his concern at having so melancholy a duty to perform, but his lordship said that he was much obliged to him, and took it kindly that he accompanied him. The Earl was attired in a white suit, richly embroidered with silver, and when he put it on said, "This is the suit in which I was married, and in which I will die." The procession being now formed, moved forward slowly, the landau being preceded by a considerable body of horse grenadiers, and by a carriage containing Mr. Sheriff Errington and his under sheriff Mr. Jackson, and being followed by the carriage of Mr. Sheriff Vaillant, containing Mr. Nichols, his under sheriff, a mourning coach and 6, containing some of his lordship's friends, a hearse and 6 for the conveyance of his body to the surgeon's hall after execution, and another body of military. The pace at which they proceeded, in consequence of the density of the mob, was so slow that his lordship was 2 hours and 3/4 in his landau, but during that time he appeared perfectly easy and composed, though he often expressed his anxiety to have the whole affair over, saying that the apparatus of death and the passing through such crowds were worse than death itself, and that he supposed so large a mob had been collected because the people had never seen a lord hanged before. He told the sheriff that he had written to the king to beg that he might suffer where his ancestor, the Earl of Essex, had been executed, and that he was in the greater hopes of obtaining that favour, as he had the honour of quartering part of the same arms, and of being allied to his majesty, but that he had refused, and thought it hard that he must die at the place appointed for the execution of common felons. Mr. Humphreys took occasion to observe that the world would naturally be very inquisitive concerning the religion his lordship professed, and asked him if he chose to say anything upon that subject, and his lordship answered that he did not think himself accountable to the world for his sentiments on religion, but that he had always believed in and adored one God, the maker of all things, that whatever his notions were, he had never propagated them, or endeavoured to gain any persons over to his persuasion, that all countries and nations had a form of religion by which the people were governed, and that he looked upon anyone who disturbed them in it as an enemy to society; that he blamed very much my Lord Bolingbroke for permitting his sentiments on religion to be published to the world; that he never could believe what some sectaries teach, that faith alone will save mankind, so that if a man just before he dies should say only "I believe," That alone will save him. As to the crime for which he suffered, he declared that he was under particular circumstances, that he had met with so many crosses and vexations he scarce knew what he did, and he most solemnly protested that he had not the least malice against Mr. Johnson. When his lordship had got to that part of Holborn which is near Drury Lane, he said he was thirsty and should be glad of a glass of wine and water, upon which the sheriffs, remonstrating to him that a stop for that purpose would necessarily draw a greater crowd about him, which might possibly disturb and incommode him, yet if his lordship still desired it, it should be done. He most readily answered, "That's true, I say no more, let us by no means stop." When they approached near the place of execution, his lordship, pointing to Mrs. Clifford, told the sheriff that there was a person waiting in a coach near there, for whom he had a very sincere regard, and of whom he should be glad to take his leave before he died. The sheriff answered that if his lordship insisted upon it, it should be so, but that he wished his lordship for his own sake would decline it, lest the sight of a person for whom he had such a regard should unman him and disarm him of the fortitude he possessed. His lordship, without the least hesitation, replied, "Sir, if you think I am wrong, I submit," and upon the sheriff telling his lordship that if he had anything to deliver to the individual referred to, or anyone else, he would faithfully do it, his lordship delivered to him a pocket-book, in which were a bank-note and a ring, and a purse with some guineas, which were afterwards handed over to the unhappy woman. The landau now being advanced to the place of execution, his lordship alighted from it, and ascended the scaffold with the same composure and fortitude of mind he had exhibited from the time he left the Tower. Soon after he had mounted the scaffold, Mr. Humphreys asked his lordship if he chose to say prayers, which he declined, but upon his asking him if he did not choose to join him in the Lord's Prayer, he readily answered he would, for he always thought it a very fine prayer, upon which they knelt down together upon two cushions, covered with black baize, and his lordship, with an audible voice, very devoutly repeated the Lord's Prayer, and afterwards with great energy ejaculated, "O God, forgive me all my errors, pardon all my sins." His lordship then rising took his leave of the sheriff and the chaplain, and after thanking them for their many civilities, presented his watch to Mr. Sheriff Vaillant, of which he desired his acceptance, and requested that his body might be buried at Bredon or Stanton in Leicestershire. The executioner now proceeded to do his duty, to which his lordship with great resignation submitted. His neckcloth being taken off, a white cap which he had brought in his pocket being put upon his head, his arms secured by a black sash, and the cord put around his neck, he advanced by 3 steps to the elevated part of the scaffold, and standing under the cross-beam which went over it, which was also covered with black baize, he asked the executioner, "Am I right?" Then the cap was drawn over his face, and upon a signal given by the sheriff, for his lordship, upon being before asked, declined to give one himself, that part upon which he stood instantly sunk down from beneath his feet, and he was launched into eternity, May the 5th, 1760. From the time of his lordship's ascending upon the scaffold until his execution was about 8 minutes, during which his countenance did not change nor his tongue falter. The accustomed time of 1 hour being past, the coffin was raised up with the greatest decency to receive the body, and being deposited in the hearse was conveyed by the sheriffs with the same procession to Surgeons' Hall to undergo the remainder of the sentence. A large incision was then made from the neck to the bottom of the breast, and another across the throat. The lower part of the belly was laid open, and the bowels taken away. It was afterwards publicly exposed to view in a room up one pair of stairs at the Hall, and on the evening of Thursday, the 8th of May, it was delivered to his friends for interment. The following verse is said to have been found in his apartment: "In doubt I lived, in doubt I die, yet stand prepared the vast abyss to try, and undismayed expect eternity." End of part 25. Part 26 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 26. Theodore Gardell, executed for murder. This delinquent was a native of Geneva, and besides being a man of good general education, was somewhat celebrated in his native city as a painter on enamel. Unhappy in his domestic concerns, in the year 1760 he repaired to London, and took lodgings in the house of a Mrs. King, who lived in Leicester Fields, and who was the unfortunate subject of his crime. The circumstances attending the murder were as follows. On Thursday, 19th February 1761, the servant girl got up at about 7 o'clock in the morning, and being presently called by Gardelle, who occupied an upper apartment, was desired to go on some errands for him. The girl took the messages and went to her mistress, who was still in her bedroom, which was at the back parlour, telling her what Gardelle had desired her to do, to which her mistress replied, "Nanny, you can't go, for there's nobody to answer at the street door." The girl, being willing to oblige Gardelle, answered that Mr. Gardelle would come down and sit in the parlour until she came back. And then she went again to Gardelle, who, in obedience to her wish, proceeded into the front room on the ground floor. The girl went out, taking the key of the street door with her to let herself in again, Gardelle then having entered the room next to Mrs. King's apartment. Immediately after she was gone out, Mrs. King, hearing the tread of somebody in the parlour, called out, "Who is there?" and at the same time opened her chamber door, and saw Gardelle at a table very near the door, who had just then taken up a book that lay upon it. He had some time before drawn Mrs. King's picture, which she wanted to have made very handsome, and had teased him so much about it that the effect was just contrary, and it happened unfortunately that the first thing she said to him when she saw him walking about in the room was something reproachful about this picture. Provoked at the insult, as he spoke English very imperfectly, for want of a better expression, he told her with some warmth that she was an impertinent woman. The detail of the whole of the circumstances immediately attending this part of the transaction, of necessity, could not fall within the knowledge or observation of any witness, and it is therefore derived from a statement drawn up by Gardelle while in custody. But having stated the facts already mentioned, he says that this insult threw Mrs. King into a transport of rage, and she gave him a blow with her fist on the breast, so violent that he could not have thought it could have been given by a woman. As soon as the blow was struck, she drew a little back, and at the same instant he laid his hand on her shoulder and pushed her from him, rather in contempt than anger, or with a design to hurt her, but her foot happening to catch in the floor-cloth, she fell backwards, and her head came with great force against the corner of the bedstead. The blood immediately gushed from her mouth, not in a continued stream, but as if by different strokes of a pump, and he instantly ran to her, expressing his concern at the accident, but she pushed him away and threatened, though in a feeble and interrupted voice, to punish him for what he had done. He was terrified at the thought of being condemned for a criminal act upon her accusation, and again attempted to assist her by raising her up, as the blood still flowed from her mouth in great quantities, but she exerted all her strength to keep him off, and still cried out, mixing threats with her screams. He then seized an ivory comb, with a sharp taper point, continued from the back for adjusting the curls of the hair which lay upon her toilet, and threatened her in his turn to prevent her crying out. But she still continuing to scream, though with a voice still fainter and fainter, he struck her with this instrument, probably in the throat, upon which the blood poured from her mouth in yet greater quantities, and her voice was quite stopped. Then he drew the bedclothes over her to prevent her blood from spreading on the floor, and to hide her from his sight, and he stood some time motionless by her, and then fell down by her side in a swoon. When he came to himself he perceived the maid was come in, and he therefore went out of the room without examining the body to see if the unhappy woman was quite dead, and his confusion was then so great that he staggered against the wainscot, and hit his head so as to raise a bump over his eye. It appears that he subsequently sent the girl away, informing her that he had her mistress's orders to dismiss her, and paid 10 shillings for her wages, and the latter, having been unable to find either her mistress or Gardelle on her first returning to the house, and knowing the former to be a woman of light character, concluded that they must have been in bed together, and that her mistress, being ashamed to meet her, determined to get rid of her. Her suspicions were not at all raised therefore, and she went away, informing Gardelle that Mr. Wright, who lodged in the house, but had been out of town, would return that evening with his servant. On her departure, the first thing that Gardelle did was to go into the chamber to Mrs. King, whom, upon examination, he found quite dead. He therefore took off the blankets and sheets with which he had covered her, and stripped off the shift, and laid the body quite naked upon the bed. Before this, he said, his linen was not stained, but it was much discoloured by his removing of the body. He then took the 2 blankets, the sheets, the coverlet, and one of the curtains, and put them into the water tub in the back wash-house to soak, they being all much stained with blood. A shift he carried upstairs, and putting it into a bag, concealed it under his bed. His own shirt, now bloody, he pulled off, and locked it up in a drawer of his bureau. When all this was done, he went and sat down in the parlour, and soon after, it being about 9 o'clock, Mr. Wright's servant, whose name was Pelsey, came in without his master, who had changed his mind, and was gone to a gentleman's house in Castle Street. He went up to his room, the garret, and sat there till about 11 o'clock, when he came down, and finding Gardelle still in the parlour, he asked if Mrs. King was come home, and who must sit up for her. Gardelle said she was not come home, but that he would sit up for her. In the morning, Friday, when Pelsey came downstairs, he again asked if Mrs. King was come home, and Gardelle told him that she had been at home, but was gone again, and he subsequently said that she was gone to Bath or Bristol. The demeanour of Gardelle was soon observed by Pelsey to be much changed, and fancying that it was in consequence of the absence of Mrs. King, he went into the Haymarket, and procured a girl of unfortunate character, named Walker, to go and stay in the house with him. A Mrs. Pritchard was also engaged as charwoman, and still no suspicions being entertained, all the parties continued to live in the house. On the Saturday morning, Gardelle first took steps to dispose of the body of the deceased woman, and no plan struck him as being so readily to be carried out as that of a gradual destruction of its members by fire. He accordingly proceeded to light a fire in the garret, whither he carried the bones, from which he had previously scraped the flesh, and burned them. All went on well till the Tuesday morning, when Pelsey, who was going up to his master's room, smelt something offensive, and asked Gardelle, who was pushing up the sash of the window on the staircase, what it was. Gardelle replied somebody had put a bone in the fire. At night Pelsey renewed his inquiries after Mrs. King, and Gardelle answered with seeming impatience, "Me not know of Mrs. King. She gave me a great deal of trouble, but me shall hear of her on Wednesday or Thursday." On Tuesday night he told Walker he would sit up till Mrs. King came home, though he had before told her she was out of town, and desired her to go to bed, and as soon as she was gone he renewed his horrid employment of cutting the body to pieces, and disposing of it in different places. The bowels he threw down the necessary, and the flesh of the body and limbs, cut to pieces, he scattered about in the cockloft, where he supposed they would dry and perish without putrefaction. Wednesday passed like the preceding days, and on Thursday he told his female companion that he expected Mrs. King home in the evening, and therefore desired that she would provide herself a lodging, giving her at the same time 2 of Mrs. King's shifts, and being thus dismissed, she went away. Pritchard, the charwoman, still continued in her office, and through her means the murder was discovered. The water having failed in the cistern on the Tuesday, she had recourse to that in the water tub in the back kitchen. Upon pulling out the spigot a little water ran out, but as there appeared to be more in, she got upon a ledge, and putting her hand in, she felt something soft. She then fetched a poker, and pressing down the contents of the tub, she got water in a pail. She informed Pelsey of the circumstance, and they agreed the first opportunity to see what the things in the water tub were. Yet so languid was their curiosity, and so careless were they of the event, that it was Thursday before the tub was examined. They found in it the blankets, sheets, and coverlet that Gardelle had put in to soak, and after spreading, shaking, and looking at them, they put them again into the tub, and the next morning, when Pelsey came down, he saw the curtain hanging on the banisters of the kitchen stairs. Upon looking down, he saw Gardelle just come out of the wash-house door where the tub stood. When Pritchard the charwoman came, he asked her if she had been taking the curtains out of the tub, and she said no. She then went and looked in the tub, and found the sheets had been wrung out. Upon this the first step was taken toward inquiring after the unhappy woman, who had now lain dead more than a week in the house. Pelsey found out the maid whom Gardelle had dismissed, and suspicions being excited that Mrs. King had been unfairly dealt with, the aid of the police was obtained. Gardelle was then apprehended, and his answers to the questions put to him being of a very equivocal nature, a search was made in the house, and the remains of the body being discovered, disposed of as we have already mentioned, as well as the linen of the deceased, and of the prisoner stained with blood, his guilt was considered to be fully established, and he was committed to Newgate for trial. While in that prison he made 2 attempts to destroy himself by taking laudanum, and by swallowing halfpence to the number of 12, but although he was considerably injured by the latter attempt, he failed in securing his object. He afterwards showed strong marks of penitence and contrition, and behaved with great humility, openness, and courtesy to those who visited him. On Thursday the 2nd of April he was tried at the Old Bailey, and in his defence he insisted only that he had no malice of the deceased, and that her death was the consequence of the fall. He was convicted and sentenced to be executed on Saturday the 4th of the same month. The account which he wrote in prison, and which is mentioned in this narrative, is dated the 28th of March, though he did not communicate it till after his trial. The night after his condemnation his behaviour was extravagant and outrageous, but the next morning he was composed and quiet, and said he had slept 3 or 4 hours in the night. When he was asked why he did not make his escape, he answered that he feared some innocent person might then suffer in his stead. He was executed April the 4th, 1761, amidst the shouts and hisses of an indignant populace, in the Haymarket near Panton Street, to which he was led by Mrs. King's house, where the cart made a stop. His body was hung in chains upon Hounslow Heath. John Macnaughton, Esquire, executed for murder. John Macnaughton, Esquire, was the son of a merchant at Derry, whose father had been an alderman of Dublin. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and on his coming of age he entered into a landed estate of £600 a year in the county of Tyrone, which was left to him by Dr. Macnaughton, his uncle. The first vice he fell into was that of gaming, by which he very soon did great injury to his fortune, and though he continued, as most novices do who play with sharpers, in a constant run of ill luck, and was soon obliged to mortgage his property, yet his losses made no visible alteration in his temper. Although he was of a most passionate disposition, his pride kept him within due bounds there. All was placid with the polite Macnaughton, and he lost his money to the very last with that graceful composure that became the man who had a plentiful fortune to support it. But strong as his passion this way might be, it was not powerful enough to secure him against the attacks of love, and becoming attached to a young lady, he very speedily married her. The reader may well suppose that the expenses of a wife and family in Dublin must soon increase his difficulties and introduce a new scene of troubles, and it did so in a manner and with an effect which was most unhappy for Mr. Macnaughton. It appears that a writ having been issued against him at the suit of one of his creditors, the sheriff's officer obtained access to his house by a stratagem, of which he flew into a rage, and calling out for pistols, he frighted his poor listening wife to such a degree that premature labour followed, and she died in childbed. The feelings of the unfortunate husband upon the occurrence of this melancholy event were most distressing, and he made repeated attempts upon his life, but a change of scene being recommended, he was conveyed to the country, where every attention was paid to his health, while his fortune was also nursed with equal care. On his return to the gaiety of the Irish metropolis, he soon resumed that worst of passions, gaming, and again became the dupe of others, while his property was once more seriously diminished. At this time he made secret advances to Miss Knox, the beautiful and accomplished daughter of Richard Knox, Esquire, of Prowen, in the county of Derry, who was possessed of a handsome fortune, and whose promise of marriage he obtained, in the event of her father's consent being given. On that consent being requested, however, it was at once refused, on account of the youth of the young lady, whose age did not exceed 16 years, and Mr. Knox was so resolute in his refusal that he forbade the suitor for his daughter's hand ever to enter the house again. Mr. Macnaughton begged that this latter injunction might be withdrawn, urging that it would appear strange to the world that his friendship with a family, with which he had been so intimate, should be so suddenly broken off, and upon his promising upon his honour that the subject of the marriage should not again be mentioned, and declaring that he had not previously spoken of it to the young lady herself, his visits were allowed to be repeated. In the meantime he continued his addresses to the young lady, and informed her that he had obtained the consent of her father, but that the marriage must be postponed for a year or two, when some material business would be settled, which was required to be decided first. And under this assurance she no longer withheld the confession that the passion of her admirer was returned, and appeared to delight most in the company of the man whom she looked upon as her future husband. All her hopes were, however, soon doomed to be blasted. One day, being in company with Mr. Macnaghten and a little boy in a retired room in the house, he pressed her to marry him, protesting he never could be happy till he was sure of her, and with an air of sprightly raillery, pulling out a prayer book, he began to read the marriage service, and insisted on the young lady making the responses, which she did, but to every one she always added, provided her father consented. Some short time after this, Miss Knox going to a friend's house on a week's visit, Mr. Macnaghten, being also an intimate there, soon followed her, and here he fixed his scene for action. After a day or two he claimed her, and, calling her his wife, insisted on consummation, but the young lady absolutely refused to comply, and leaving the house went directly and informed her uncle of the whole affair. On this Mr. Knox wrote a letter to Mr. Macnaghten, telling him what a base, dishonourable villain he was, and bade him avoid his sight for ever. But upon the receipt of this letter, Macnaghten advertised his marriage in the public newspapers, cautioning every other man not to marry his lawful wife. This vile attack was answered by a very spirited and proper advertisement from the father, with an affidavit of the whole affair from the daughter annexed, and Mr. Knox having commenced a suit in the prerogative court, the marriage was declared invalid. Mr. Macnaghten, having absconded to avoid his debts, could not now appeal to the Court of Delegates, and the original decree was confirmed. Judge Scott in consequence issued his warrant for the apprehension of the defendant, who was liable to pay costs, and Macnaghten, hearing of this, wrote a most impudent, threatening letter to the judge, and, it is said, lay in wait to have him murdered, but missed him by the judge's taking another road. Upon this the judge applied to the Lord Chief Justice, who issued another writ against him, which drove him to England. In the summer of 1761 Mr. Macnaghten returned to Ireland, and by constantly hovering round Mr. Knox's house, obliged the family to be upon their guard, and the young lady to live like a recluse. About the middle of the summer, however, she ventured to a place called Swaddling Bar, to drink the mineral waters there for her health. But even thither this unhappy man followed her, and he was seen in a beggar's habit dogging her footsteps. Thus disguised he was detected, and when warned never to appear there again, he swore, in the presence of several, that he would murder the whole family if he did not get possession of his wife, a threat which he subsequently attempted to carry out. Notwithstanding his violence, it appears that he was permitted again to escape to London, and he remained there until the month of October in the same year. At the beginning of November he was again seen in Ireland, and having approached the residence of the Knoxes, he was known to sleep with 3 of his accomplices at the house of a hearth money collector, very nearly adjoining the abode of his intended victim. The 10th was the day fixed upon by him for the attack, and on that morning Macnaghten with his companions went to a cabin on the roadside with a sack full of firearms, in order to await the passing of Mr. Knox's coach, in which it was known the family were about to proceed to Dublin. One of the men was dispatched to ascertain the moment of the coming of the vehicle, and when it appeared in sight, having obtained the information requisite for its identification, he hurried back to desire the projector of the scheme to prepare. It appears that the only persons in the carriage were Mr. Knox and his wife, their daughter and a maid-servant, and they were attended only by one livery servant, and a faithful fellow, a smith, who was foster-father to Miss Knox, and whom no bribe could ever purchase, although most of the other servants had been tampered with. As soon as the coach came near the cabin, 2 of the villains armed with guns presented themselves to the postilion and coachman, and stopped the horses, while Macnaghten fired at the smith with a blunderbuss. The latter escaped being wounded, and presented his piece in return, but it unfortunately missed fire, and Macnaghten and one of his companions, seizing the opportunity, again fired, and both of them wounded him. Mr. Knox at this time drew up the blinds of the carriage, and Macnaghten, observing this, ran round to the other side, and firing in at the window obliquely with a gun loaded with 5 balls, shot Miss Knox, all the balls taking effect in her body. The maidservant now let down the window, screaming that her mistress was murdered, and the livery servant, on hearing this, came from behind a peat stack where he had concealed himself for safety, and firing at Macnaghten wounded him in the back. And about the same time Mr. Knox from the coach discharged a pistol, which was the last of 8 shots fired on this strange and dreadful occasion. The murderer and his accomplices now immediately fled, and Miss Knox, being carried into the cabin, died in about 3 hours. An attack so bold and so diabolical in its nature excited the greatest degree of interest, and large rewards were instantly offered for the apprehension of the perpetrator of the murder. For a considerable time all search proved fruitless, but at length the corporal of Sir James Caldwell's company of light horse secured him under the following circumstances. It appears that the corporal had received instructions to search the house and offices of one Wenslow, a farmer, and had examined every place without success, when he bethought himself of a stratagem by which to obtain the requisite information of the murderer's hiding place. Observing a fellow digging potatoes in a piece of ground behind the stables, he remarked in his hearing that it was a great pity that Macnaghten could not be found, for that the person who discovered his retreat would be sure of a reward of £300. The bait took, and the peasant pointed to a barn, and thither the corporal and his assistants immediately proceeded. The door was fast, but at length they forced it open, and there they found the object of their search, standing with a gun at his shoulder, apparently determined to resist all efforts made to secure him. On the appearance of the corporal he fired at him, but without wounding him, and a shot from the corporal's gun striking him on the wrist, he was compelled to surrender. He was immediately secured and carried to Lifford Gaol, where he remained in the closest confinement until the 8th of December 1761, when he was put upon his trial, with an accomplice named Dunlap, before Mr. Baron Mountney and Mr. Justice Scott, on a special commission. Macnaghten, still suffering from the effects of the wounds which he had received, was brought into a court on a bier, rolled in a blanket, and wearing the shirt in which he was taken, still smeared with blood. His beard had grown to an enormous length, and his head was wrapped in a greasy woollen nightcap. In that condition he made a long speech, pointedly and sensibly, and complained in the most pathetic manner of the hard usage he had met with since his confinement. He said they had treated him like a man under sentence, and not like a man that was to be tried. He declared with tears in his eyes that he never intended to kill his dear wife, but that he only designed to take her away. The case lasted 5 days, a considerable portion of the first day being occupied in pleadings to postpone the trial, and the reply of the counsel for the Crown. During these debates Macnaghten often spoke with most amazing spirit and judgment, but the result was that he was ordered to prepare his affidavit, which the court would take into consideration. Accordingly, on the 9th he was brought into court again, and his affidavit read, in which he swore that some material witnesses for him were not to be had, particularly one Owens, who he said was present all the time, but the court were of opinion that no sufficient reason for the application was shown, and the trial in consequence proceeded. During the whole proceedings Macnaghten took his notes as regularly as any of the lawyers, and cross-examined all the witnesses with the greatest accuracy, and he was observed to behave with uncommon resolution. His chief defence was founded on a letter he produced, as written to him by Miss Knox, in which she desired him to intercept her on the road to Dublin and take her away, but this letter was proved a forgery of his own, which after condemnation he confessed. He took great pains to exculpate himself from the least design to murder anyone, much less his dear wife, as he always called her. He declared solemnly that his intent was only to take her out of the coach and carry her off, but as he received the first wound from the first shot that was fired, the anguish of that wound and the prospect of his ill success in his design so distracted him that, being wholly involved in confusion and despair, he fired he knew not at what or whom, and had the misfortune to kill the only person in the world that was dear to him. That he gave the court that trouble, and laboured thus not to save his life, for death was now his choice, but to clear his character from such horrid guilt as that which was ascribed to him. The jury, however, found both prisoners guilty, and Macnaghten received the intimation without any concern, declaring that they had acquitted themselves with justice to the country. Mr. Baron Mountney then pronounced upon both prisoners the awful sentence which the law directed, and although the court were visibly affected by the manner in which this painful duty was performed, Macnaghten remained unconcerned. He prayed to the court to have mercy upon Dunlap, alleging that he was his tenant, and had been compelled by him to participate with him in the transaction under pain of losing a lease, which he hoped to be renewed, but he declared that life was not worth asking for himself, for that his wife being dead, the better half of himself was gone, and he had nothing to remain for in this world. Tuesday, 15th of December 1761 was fixed upon for the execution of these criminals, but it appears that some difficulty was experienced in carrying the sentence into effect. For a long time no carpenter could be found to make the gallows, and the sheriff looked out for a tree proper for the purpose, and the execution must have been performed on it, had not the uncle of the young lady, and some other gentlemen, made the gallows and put it up. The sheriff was afterwards obliged to take a party of soldiers and force a smith to take off the prisoner's bolts, otherwise he must have been obliged, contrary to law, to execute them with their bolts on. The time for the execution having arrived, M'Naughton, attended by his fellow prisoner, walked to the place of execution, but being weak of his wounds, was supported between two men. The former was dressed in a white flannel waistcoat, trimmed with black buttons and holes, a diaper nightcap tied with a black riband, white stockings, mourning buckles, and a crape tied on his arm. He desired the executioner to be speedy, and the fellow pointing to the ladder, he mounted with great spirit. The moment he was tied up, he jumped from it with such vehemence as snapped the rope, and he fell to the ground, but without dislocating his neck or doing himself much injury. When they had raised him on his legs again, he soon recovered his senses, and the executioner, borrowing the rope from Dunlap and fixing it round M'Naughton's neck, he went up the ladder a second time, and tying the rope himself to the gallows, he jumped from it again with the same force, and appeared dead in a minute. The spectators who saw him drop when the rope broke looked upon it as some contrivance for his escape, which they favoured all they could by running away from the place and leaving it open. Dunlap was afterwards turned off in the usual manner, in sight of the dangling body of his accomplice and master. End of part 26. Part 27 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 27. John Smith and Robert Mayne, executed for a mutiny on board the King George. On the trial of these men, with 5 more of the crew, it appeared that disputes arose on board the King George, a fine privateer, of 32 guns and 200 men, commanded by Captain Reed, and cruising against the enemies of the country, concerning some prize wine which was stowed in the hold, some of the crew insisting on its being hoisted up to be used for the whole ship's company. This would have been attended, in their situation, with both difficulty and danger, and was consequently opposed by Captain Reed and his officers, and being disappointed, a factious discontented set endeavoured to corrupt the remainder, and soon gained over so formidable a party that they determined to seize the ship and turn pirates in the Indian seas. In order to effect this, off Cape Ortugal, the mutineers demanded the keys of the arms chest, and on the refusal of their request they drove the captain and the officers into the cabin. They then placed a guard at the door and brought a 9-pounder carriage gun, loaded with round and grape shot, to fire among the officers, but were prevailed upon to desist by the entreaties of Mr. Gardner, the sailing master. They then offered the latter the command of the ship, acquainting him with their intention of steering for the East Indies, but on his refusal they put him under a guard and took the ship into their own care, until they had, for want of skill, nearly lost her. They then released Mr. Gardner and gave him the helm, when he steered into Camarinas in Spain, where most of the mutineers took to the boats and made their escape. Such as were apprehended were brought to trial, and though 2 more, viz. Thomas Baldwin and Lawrence Tierman, were found guilty, yet Smith and Mayne, who were the ringleaders of the mutiny, only were hanged. They suffered at Execution Dock, May the 10th, 1762. They were both Irishmen and Roman Catholics, and were attended by a priest of that religion. A few years after this affair, a mutiny broke out among the crew of the Namur of 90 guns. 15 were tried, found guilty, and ordered to be hanged, and they were taken for execution on board the Royal Anne, with halters round their necks. While waiting for the fatal gun being fired, however, they were told that His Majesty had pardoned 14 of them, but 1 of them must die, and they were ordered to cast lots. How exquisite must have been the feelings of these miserable men at the awful moment of deciding on the fate of one. The fatal lot fell upon the second man that drew, Matthew McCann, who was soon run up to the yardarm, where the body hung nearly an hour. The pardoned seamen were turned over to the Grafton and the Sunderland under sailing orders for the East Indies. Hannah Dago, executed for robbery. There is so much eccentricity in the mode which this unhappy wretch terminated her existence, that although the circumstances of the robbery for which she was convicted are not of an interesting nature, we cannot forbear mentioning her case. We have adduced many instances of hardness of heart and contempt of the commandments of God in men who have undergone the last sentence of the law, but we are of opinion that in this woman will be found a more relentless heart in her last moments than any criminal whom we have yet recorded. Hannah Dago was born in Ireland, and was one of that numerous class of women who ply at Covent Garden Market as a basket woman. In the pursuit of her vocation she became acquainted with a poor and industrious woman of the name of Eleanor Hussey, who lived by herself in a small apartment, in which was some creditable household furniture, the remains of the worldly goods of her deceased husband. Seizing an opportunity when the owner was from home, this daring woman broke into Hussey's room and stripped it of every article which it contained. For this burglary and robbery she was brought to trial at the Old Bailey, found guilty, and sentenced to death. She was a strong, masculine woman, the terror of her fellow prisoners, and actually stabbed one of the men who had given evidence against her, but the wound happened not to prove dangerous. On the road to Tyburn she showed little concern at her miserable state, and paid no attention to the exhortations of the Romish priest who attended her. When the cart, in which she was bound, was drawn under the gallows, she got her hands and arms loose, seized the executioner, struggled with him, and gave him so violent a blow on the breast as nearly knocked him down. She dared him to hang her, and in order to revenge herself upon him and cheat him of his dues, she took off her hat, cloak, and other parts of her dress, and disposed of them among the crowd. After much resistance he got the rope around her neck, which she had no sooner found accomplished than, pulling out a handkerchief, she bound it round her head, over her face, and threw herself out of the cart before the signal given, with such violence that she broke her neck and died instantly. This extraordinary and unprecedented scene occurred on the 4th of May 1763. Barney Carroll and William King, executed for cutting and maiming. These men had served their country as soldiers, and it is remarkable that having in that capacity conducted themselves with great bravery and earned for themselves well-merited rewards, they should afterwards have resorted to such atrocious means of procuring a livelihood as from this case it will appear they adopted. Having returned to England from the Havannah, where their regiment had been stationed, they obtained their discharge, and determined to commence robbers on a plan of the most infamous cruelty. This consisted in their procuring 2 young thieves named Byfield and Matthews to go before them and to pick pockets, and in case of their being detected and seized, their villainous employers would run up, and by maiming the persons holding the boys, generally by cutting him across the eyes, would procure their release. The offence for which they were executed was committed on the 17th of June 1765, and it appears that a gentleman named Kirby was selected by the gang as a fit object for attack. Mr. Kirby, however, detected Byfield in picking his pocket, and before he could withdraw his hand he seized him and threatened to carry him before the magistrates. His intention was not to pursue this threat, but in order to terrify the boy, he dragged him a considerable distance through the Strand, where the circumstance had occurred. Carroll soon came up to him and demanded the boy's release, but Byfield, guessing that he would be permitted to escape, told him to keep off, for that the gentleman would let him go. The answer given by the ruffian was, "Damn him, but I will cut him," and instantly drawing his knife, he gave Mr. Kirby a severe cut over the face. A Mr. Carr at the moment came up to the assistance of Mr. Kirby and seized Carroll's arm, and at this instant Kirby, letting go the boy, struck at Carroll, but the blow happening to fall on Mr. Carr's hand, the villain made his escape. The rogues then ran off towards St. Clement's Church, and escaped through an alley into Wych Street, though closely pursued by the gentleman. Mr. Kirby now felt great pain, but had no idea that he had been wounded by any sharp instrument, but putting his hand to his face he found that it streamed with blood. Going to the Crown and Anchor Tavern in the Strand, Mr. Ingram, a surgeon of eminence, almost immediately attended him, and although the utmost expedition was used in calling in the assistance of that gentleman, Mr. Kirby had lost near 2 quarts of blood in the short interval. On examination it appeared that the wound was given in a transverse direction from the right eye to the left temple, that 2 large vessels were divided by it, that there was a cut across the nose which left the bone visible, and that the eyeballs must have been divided by the slightest deviation from the stroke. The abominable assassins were very soon apprehended, and found guilty under the Coventry Act, and hanged at Tyburn, July 31st, 1765, amid the execrations of an enraged multitude. The Coventry Act is a statute of the 22nd and 23rd Charles II. Its provision in respect of this crime is to the following effect: if any person on purpose, and by malice aforethought, and by laying in wait, shall unlawfully cut or disable the tongue, put out an eye, slit the nose, cut off a nose or lip, or cut off or disable any limb or member of any subject, with intention, in so doing, to maim or disfigure him, the person so offending, his counsellors, aiders, abettors, knowing of and privy to the offence, shall be guilty of felony, without benefit of clergy. It is called the Coventry Act because it was passed on Sir John Coventry being assaulted, and having his nose slit in the street, and the following anecdote is related of the circumstances under which this outrage was committed. In the Committee of Ways and Means in the House of Commons it had been resolved that, towards the supply, every one that resorts to any of the playhouses who sits in the boxes shall pay 1 shilling, every one who sits in the pit shall pay 6pence, every other person 3pence. This resolution, to which the House disagreed upon the report, was opposed in the committee by the courtiers, who gave for a reason that the players were the king's servants, and a part of his pleasure. To this Sir John Coventry, one of the members, by way of reply, asked whether the king's pleasure lay among the men or among the women players. This being reported at court, it was highly resented, and a resolution was privately taken to set a mark on Sir John to prevent others from taking the like liberties. December the 20th was the night that the House of Commons adjourned for the Christmas holidays. On the 25th, one of the Duke of Monmouth's troop of Life Guards, and some few foot, lay in wait from 10 at night till 2 in the morning by Suffolk Street, and as Sir John returned from the tavern where he supped, to his own house, they threw him down, and with a knife cut the end of his nose almost off, but company coming made them fearful to finish it. The debates which this affair occasioned in the House of Commons ran very high, and one of the members emphatically called the attack on Coventry a horrid un-English act. The result was that the statute in question was passed. Peter McKinley, George Gidley, Andrew Zeckerman, and Richard St. Quentin, executed for murder. This case exhibits a remarkable series of adventures which occurred to the unfortunate man who, after having survived many engagements and imprisonments, was doomed to become one of the victims of a horrid and piratical scheme. The unfortunate Captain Glass was the son of a minister of the Church of Scotland, who obtained some notice from his writings, in which he opposed the practice of religion according to particular forms, and was the founder of a sect called Glassites. At an early period of his life, young Glass exhibited talents of no ordinary character, and having taken a degree of Master of Arts at one of the Scotch universities, he applied himself to the study of medicine. He made rapid progress in this new line of learning, and after he had taken the necessary degrees, was employed as a surgeon on board a trading vessel bound for the coast of Guinea, and in that capacity he afterwards made several voyages to America. His superior qualifications gained him a distinguished place in the esteem of several merchants, who entrusted him the command of a vessel in the Guinea trade, and his conduct proved highly to the advantage of his owners and equally honourable to himself. When the war against France was declared, Captain Glass found himself in possession of a very considerable sum, a great part of which he determined to venture on board a privateer, and he in consequence caused a vessel to be fitted out with all possible expedition, and took the command on himself. In about 10 days after they had commenced this voyage, they made prize of a ship richly laden, belonging to France, which they carried into port at the West Indies, but soon afterwards being obliged to engage 2 vessels of war, after an obstinate contest, they were compelled to submit to the superior power of the enemy and strike, but not until Captain Glass had been severely wounded and most of his men slain. The captain, being conveyed to France, was there consigned to a prison, but an interchange of prisoners taking place, he once more trod on British ground. Nothing daunted by the unsuccessful termination of his first venture, he tried a second expedition of a similar character, in which he was equally unfortunate, and was once again consigned to the keeping of a French jailor, in whose custody he remained until the termination of the war. he next conceived a design of sailing in search of discoveries, and in pursuance of this plan he purchased a vessel adapted to this purpose, and having carefully made every necessary preparation for the prosecution of his object, he directed his course towards the coast of Africa. Between the river Senegal and Cape de Verde he discovered a commodious harbour, from which he entertained the reasonable expectation that very great commercial advantages might be derived, and he returned to England, and communicated his discovery to the government, who granted him an exclusive trade to the harbour for the space of 20 years. That he might be able to pursue his project with greater advantage, he now engaged in partnership with 2 or 3 gentlemen of fortune, and a vessel furnished with all necessary articles being again prepared, he sailed for the newly discovered harbour, and arrived at it in safety. He soon found, however, that the habits of the natives would not permit any friendly intercourse to be maintained between them, and being in great distress for provisions, the captain and 3 men proceeded in an open boat to the Canary Islands. During their absence the natives made an attack upon the vessel, but were repulsed, and the first mate, who had been left in command of her, thought fit to sheer off, and having in vain sought his captain, at length returned to England. Glass and his companions meanwhile had arrived at one of the Canary Islands, and having landed, with a view of petitioning to be allowed to purchase provisions, was instantly seized by order of the governor, and conveyed to a dungeon as a spy. In this situation he remained for 6 months, but at length he made one of his countrymen, a sailor, acquainted with his condition by writing his name and the nature of his miseries on a biscuit with a piece of charcoal, and throwing it to him through his prison window when he was passing beneath. The sailor immediately conveyed it to his commander, but the latter, on making application for his release, was himself seized and subjected to treatment of similar severity. The news of this circumstance was, however, directly carried to England by a vessel which was on the point of sailing, and speedy complaint being made to the Spanish government, the liberty of the 2 captains was soon obtained. At about this time the wife and daughter of Captain Glass had arrived at the Canaries in consequence of the reports which had reached them of his captivity, and the first joy of again meeting being past, they all embarked on board a ship bound for London, commanded by a Captain Cochrane. Miss Glass at this time was a young lady of about 12 years of age, and ill deserving the fate which awaited her, as well as her parents. It appears that while the ship lay at the Canaries, a plot was concerted between Peter M'Kinley, the boatswain, a native of Ireland, George Gidley, the cook, born in the west of Yorkshire, Richard St. Quintin, a native of the same county, and Andrew Zekerman, a Dutchman, for murdering all the other persons on board, and seizing the treasure, which, including what Captain Glass had shipped in behalf of himself and his partners, amounted to £100,000 in dollars. The villains made 3 attempts on different nights to carry their horrid plan into execution, but were prevented through the circumspection of their commander. At length, however, the conspirators were appointed to the night watch on the 13th of November, when the ship had reached the British Channel, and about midnight, the captain going upon the quarter deck to see that all things were disposed in proper order, upon his return he was seized by the boatswain, who held him while Gidley struck him with an iron bar and fractured his skull. 2 of the seamen, who were not concerned in the conspiracy, hearing the captain's groans, came upon deck and were immediately murdered, and, with their captain, were thrown overboard. Captain Glass, being alarmed, went up the gangway, and judging that a mutiny had arisen, returned to fetch his sword. M'Kinley, guessing his design, followed him down the steps leading to the cabin, and waited in the dark till he returned with a drawn sword in his hand, when, getting unperceived behind him, he seized both his arms, and then called to his accomplices to murder him. Captain Glass, being a very powerful man, had nearly disengaged himself from the ruffian, when Zekerman came up and attacked him. The captain wounded him in the arm, but before he could recover his sword he was overpowered, and the other villains soon joined their associates. The unhappy man was no sooner disarmed than he was many times run through the body, and he was then immediately thrown overboard. Mrs. Glass and her daughter, terrified by the outcry, now came on deck, and falling on their knees supplicated for mercy, but they found the villains utterly destitute of the tender feelings of humanity, and Zekerman telling them to prepare for death, they embraced each other in a most affectionate manner, and were then forced from each other's arms and thrown into the sea. Having now put all the crew to death, excepting a boy who attended Captain Glass, and another boy who was an apprentice on board the ship, the murderers steered towards the Irish coast, and on the 3rd of December found themselves within 10 leagues of the harbour of Ross, They then hoisted out the longboat and put into it dollars to the amount of 2 tons, and after knocking out the windows of the ballast ports, rowed towards the shore, leaving the 2 boys to sink with the vessel. Captain Glass's boy could not swim, and was therefore soon drowned, but the other lad swam to the boat when Zuckerman struck him a violent blow on the breast, which caused him immediately to sink. Having thus massacred 8 innocent persons, the villains proceeded to the mouth of the River Ross, but thinking it would be dangerous to go up the river with so much riches, they buried 250 bags of dollars in the sand, and conveyed as much treasure as they could possibly bear about their persons to a village called Fishertown, where they stopped for refreshment. On the following day they went to Ross, and there sold $1,200, and having purchased each a pair of pistols and hired horses for themselves and 2 guides, they rode to Dublin and took up their residence at the Black Bull in Thomas Street. The wreck of the ship was driven on shore on the day of their leaving Ross, and the manner in which the villains had lived in Fishertown and Ross, their general behaviour and other circumstances, being understood as grounds for suspicion of their being pirates, an express was dispatched by 2 gentlemen to the Lords of the Regency at Dublin, exhibiting the several causes of suspicion and giving a particular description of the supposed delinquents. On examining the wreck, a sampler worked by Miss Glass was found, from which it appeared that a part of the work was done on her birthday, which afterwards turned out to be the day preceding that on which the murders were perpetrated, and the sampler proved a principal means of leading to a discovery of the guilt of these abominable villains. The gentlemen who were commissioned to attend the Lords of the Regency had no sooner communicated their business than the Lord Mayor and Sheriffs were sent for, and proper instructions being given them, they on the same night caused McKinley and Zuckerman to be taken into custody. The prisoners were separately examined, and they both confessed the particulars of their guilt, and that their accomplices had that morning hired a post-chaise for Cork, where they meant to embark on board a vessel bound for England. Gidley and St. Quintin were then on the next day secured at an inn on the road to Cork, and they followed the example of the other prisoners in acknowledging themselves guilty. The Sheriff of Ross took possession of the effects found in the wreck, and the bags of dollars that the villains had buried in the sand, and deposited the whole in the treasury of Dublin for the benefit of the proprietors. The prisoners being brought to trial, they confessed themselves guilty of the charges alleged in the indictment, and they were condemned and suffered death on the 19th of December 1765, after which their bodies were hung in chains in the neighbourhood of Dublin. End of Part 27.